The sun was shining brightly as the Johnson family prepared for their backyard barbecue. It was a special day for them. Michael Johnson, the father of the family, had recently been promoted at his job, and they wanted to celebrate with their friends, neighbors, and loved ones. The backyard was buzzing with activity. Tables were set with plates of delicious food. The grill sizzled with burgers and hot dogs, and cheerful music played in the background. Laughter and chatter filled the air as kids ran around, playing games on the lawn. Michael stood by the grill, flipping burgers with ease, a proud smile on his face. His wife, Lisa, carried a tray of drinks to the table where a group of their friends were sitting. Their two kids, Emily and Marcus, were running around with their cousins, giggling as they chased each other with water balloons. It was a picture-perfect afternoon, and Michael couldn't have been happier. The guests, a mix of family and friends, were equally lively. Conversations flowed, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. "Michael, these burgers are fantastic," one of the guests called out. Michael laughed and waved a spatula in the air. "Only the best for my people," he replied with a grin. Across the street, Mrs. Whitman watched the scene from her window. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and was known for her stern demeanor and sharp tongue. She didn't approve of the noise coming from the Johnsons' backyard and muttered to herself as she peeked through the curtains. "They're disrupting the neighborhood," she grumbled. "All that racket. It's completely unnecessary." As the party carried on, Mrs. Whitman grew more irritated. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the music were like nails on a chalkboard to her. She sat down in her chair, glaring out the window. "How can they think this is appropriate?" she said to herself, shaking her head. The sight of more guests arriving only made her angrier. Michael, unaware of the storm brewing across the street, continued to enjoy the celebration. He moved from table to table, chatting with his guests, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. "This is what it's all about," he told Lisa as they stood by the grill. "Good food, good people, and good vibes." As the sun began to set, the glow of string lights added a warm ambience to the gathering. Guests relaxed, sharing stories and toasting to Michael's success. But across the street, Mrs. Whitman had had enough. She picked up her phone, her expression firm. "It's time to put an end to this nonsense," she said to herself. The cheerful gathering continued, the Johnson family unaware of the call Mrs. Whitman had just made. The sound of a police car approaching their street was faint at first, blending into the background noise of the city. But as the car stopped in front of their home, the joyful chatter began to fade. Guests turned their heads, wondering what was happening. Michael glanced toward the front yard, his smile fading slightly. "What's going on?" Lisa asked, concern flickering in her eyes. Michael set down his spatula and walked toward the front gate, his calm demeanor hiding the curiosity and unease beginning to build inside him. The celebration was about to take an unexpected turn, but Michael, ever the composed and thoughtful man, was ready to face whatever came next. This was his family's moment, and he wasn't going to let anything ruin it. The sound of the police car idling in front of the Johnson home was enough to quiet the lively barbecue. Guests exchanged confused glances, their cheerful conversations replaced by murmurs of concern. Michael walked toward the front yard, his steps calm but purposeful. His wife, Lisa, stood by the gate, her arms crossed as she watched two uniformed officers step out of their vehicle. "Good evening," Michael said, greeting the officers politely. "How can I help you?" The officer in charge, a woman with a serious expression, glanced at her notepad before responding. "We received a call about a noise complaint in the neighborhood. Is this your home?" Michael nodded, keeping his tone steady. "It is. We're having a barbecue to celebrate with some family and friends. I apologize if the noise disturbed anyone, but we've been mindful of the time and volume." Behind him, some of the guests moved closer, curiosity drawing them toward the front yard. Lisa joined Michael, her calm demeanor matching his. "Officer," she said kindly, "we've lived in this neighborhood for years and never had an issue like this before. Is it really necessary to send a patrol car for a barbecue? The officer shifted slightly, glancing back at her partner. We're just responding to the call, ma'am. Can we have a look around to ensure everything's in order? Michael exchanged a quick glance with Lisa before stepping aside. Of course, he said. You're welcome to take a look. We've got nothing to hide. The officers walked into the backyard, their eyes scanning the scene. The guests stood back respectfully, watching quietly as the officers inspected the setup. The food on the grill, the kids playing with water balloons, and the adults chatting at the picnic tables painted a picture of a simple family gathering. There was no sign of any disturbance, no chaos, and certainly nothing out of the ordinary. One of the officers softened slightly, realizing the call might have been exaggerated. This looks like a peaceful event, she said, nodding toward Michael. We appreciate your cooperation. As they prepared to leave, the older officer added, I'd suggest keeping the music down a little, just to avoid any further complaints. Michael smiled, his demeanor calm but firm. Understood. Thank you, officers. As the officers returned to their car, Michael's younger brother, Daryl, approached him. What was that all about? He asked, frowning. We're just having a barbecue. Michael sighed, his voice low but steady. It seems someone in the neighborhood wasn't too happy about the noise. Daryl glanced toward Mrs. Whitman's house, where the curtains twitched slightly. I think we all know who that someone is. Michael didn't respond, his focus remaining on the guests. Let's not let this ruin the night, he said, clapping a hand on Daryl's shoulder. We're here to celebrate. Back at the picnic table, the guests slowly returned to their conversations, though the earlier cheer had dimmed slightly. Lisa leaned in close to Michael. Do you think she'll try something else? Michael shook his head, his voice calm. She's had her say. Now it's time for us to enjoy the rest of the evening. The barbecue resumed, but a quiet tension lingered in the air. Michael knew that moments like these were part of a bigger story, one about community, resilience, and the strength to rise above pettiness. As the night went on, he reminded himself why they had gathered, to celebrate love, family, and success. And no one could take that away from them. The barbecue continued, but the earlier tension hung in the air like a faint shadow. Guests tried to return to their cheerful conversations, but it was clear that the unexpected visit from the police had dampened the mood. Michael noticed it too. He stood near the grill, his mind racing as he considered what to do next. He wasn't going to let the evening end on such a sour note. Lisa walked over to him, her hand lightly resting on his arm. You okay? She asked softly. Michael nodded, his smile warm but determined. I'm fine. I just want everyone to enjoy themselves. I'll take care of this. He turned to the group, clapping his hands together to get their attention. All right, everyone. He called out with a grin. I think it's time to bring out the dessert. The kids cheered, their earlier playfulness quickly returning. Lisa and a few other adults brought trays of cupcakes, pies, and bowls of fresh fruit to the picnic tables. The atmosphere began to shift as laughter and chatter slowly returned. Michael moved from table to table, making sure everyone felt welcome and at ease. Meanwhile, across the street, Mrs. Whitman watched from her window, her lips pressed into a tight line. She had expected the police visit to end the barbecue, but instead, it seemed to have brought the group even closer. Frustrated, she muttered under her breath and retreated further into her house. Back at the Johnsons' backyard, Michael noticed Mrs. Whitman's curtains fall shut. He sighed quietly, but kept his focus on his guests. He refused to let her negativity ruin what had been a joyful celebration. Instead, he decided it was time to show everyone what true leadership and kindness looked like. As the evening wore on, Michael stood to make a toast. He held up a glass of lemonade, his voice calm yet strong. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, he began. This celebration isn't just about my promotion. It's about the people who make life meaningful. My family, my friends, and my community. The group clapped and cheered, their spirits lifting as Michael continued. Sometimes life throws us challenges. Sometimes people don't understand us or see the good we're trying to create. But I've learned that the best way to respond to those moments is with love, patience, and strength. Lisa smiled as she watched Michael speak, pride glowing in her eyes. The guests nodded in agreement, their earlier unease replaced with a sense of unity. Michael raised his glass. Here's to standing strong, staying kind, and always lifting each other up. Cheers! The crowd responded, raising their glasses high. The toast seemed to lift the mood entirely. Guests laughed louder, the kids ran around again, and the barbecue felt like a celebration once more. Michael knew the evening wasn't perfect, but it was proof that kindness and determination could overcome even the most frustrating moments. As the sun set and string lights twinkled in the backyard, Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude. His family and friends had shown resilience and warmth, even in the face of unnecessary conflict. And while Mrs. Whitman's actions had momentarily shaken them, the strength of their bond had turned the night into a triumph. The celebration continued late into the evening, a reminder that nothing, not even prejudice or pettiness, could dim the light of a united community. As the night deepened, the party was back in full swing. The kids were laughing again, running through the backyard with sparklers in their hands, their joy lighting up the night. Guests chatted and enjoyed the desserts that Lisa and her friends had prepared. The earlier interruption felt like a distant memory, thanks to Michael's calm leadership and the warmth of the gathering. But Michael knew the tension hadn't completely disappeared. He noticed some of his neighbors glancing occasionally toward Mrs. Whitman's house, her curtains still drawn tightly shut. He decided it was time to take a different approach. "Daryl," Michael said, calling over his younger brother, "can you take over the grill for a bit? I'll be back." Daryl looked at him curiously, but nodded. "Sure thing, Mike. Everything okay?" Michael smiled and patted his brother on the shoulder. "It's fine. Just need to take care of something." Michael walked toward the front of the house and across the street to Mrs. Whitman's door. He took a deep breath before knocking lightly. He didn't want to confront her in anger. He wanted to have a calm and honest conversation. After a moment, the door opened slightly, and Mrs. Whitman peered out. Her face was a mixture of surprise and hesitation. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone guarded. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitman," Michael said, keeping his voice warm and polite. "I just wanted to talk for a moment. May I come in?" She hesitated, clearly uncertain, but finally opened the door wider and stepped aside. Michael entered the house, which was tidy and filled with the faint scent of lavender. Mrs. Whitman gestured for him to sit, though she remained standing, her arms crossed. Michael didn't waste time. "Mrs. Whitman, I know you called the police earlier. I'm not here to argue about it. I just want to understand why." She looked at him, her expression defensive. "Your party was loud. It's a quiet neighborhood, and not everyone wants to hear music and laughter all evening." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. We tried to keep the volume reasonable, but I'm sorry if it disturbed you." Her face softened slightly, but she still seemed tense. "It's not just the noise," she admitted quietly. Well, it feels like everything's changing. I've lived here for 30 years, and sometimes it feels like the neighborhood isn't what it used to be." Michael leaned forward, his tone gentle. "I can understand how change can feel overwhelming. But change isn't always a bad thing. It can bring new connections, new friendships. That's what our barbecue is about, celebrating community and family." Mrs. Whitman hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I suppose I didn't think of it that way." Michael smiled. "You're always welcome to join us, you know. We'd love to have you. It's not just about us. It's about bringing people together." Her posture relaxed slightly, and for the first time, she seemed to consider his words. "Maybe next time," she said softly. Michael stood, extending his hand. "The invitation is always open." Mrs. Whitman shook his hand. her grip firm but not unkind. As Michael left, he felt hopeful. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start. When he returned to the barbecue, Lisa gave him a questioning look. "Everything okay?" she asked. Michael nodded, a small smile on his face. "I think so. It'll take time, but we're moving in the right direction." The celebration carried on, and though Mrs. Whitman didn't join them that night, Michael felt a shift. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't won with arguments, but with understanding and patience. And tonight, he had planted a seed of change. The next morning, the Johnson family sat around the breakfast table, enjoying pancakes and fresh fruit. The barbecue from the night before was still the main topic of conversation. Emily, the youngest, was excitedly telling everyone about her sparklers, while Marcus bragged about how many burgers he'd eaten. Lisa, sipping her coffee, looked over at Michael with a knowing smile. "You went over to Mrs. Whitman's house last night, didn't you?" she asked. Michael nodded, cutting into his pancake. "I did. I thought it was important to talk to her, to understand why she felt the way she did." Lisa leaned forward, intrigued. "And what did she say?" "She's struggling with change," Michael explained. "She's lived here for so long, and she feels like the neighborhood isn't what it used to be. I think she's just scared of losing what's familiar to her." Lisa sighed. "That doesn't excuse her behavior, but I can see where she's coming from." Michael smiled. "Exactly. That's why I invited her to join us the next time we have a gathering. She didn't say yes, but I think it gave her something to think about." Later that day, Michael decided to take another step toward building bridges. He went out to the backyard and started cleaning up after the barbecue. As he picked up plates and folded chairs, he noticed Mrs. Whitman stepping out onto her porch. She stood there for a moment, watching him, before cautiously making her way across the street. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitman," Michael greeted her warmly, setting down a stack of chairs. "What brings you over?" She hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I just wanted to apologize," she said, her voice soft. "I realize now that I overreacted last night. Your party wasn't causing any harm." Michael smiled, his expression kind. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot. And like I said before, you're always welcome to join us." Mrs. Whitman gave a small nod, her eyes darting around the yard. "You're very kind, Mr. Johnson. I suppose I've just been stuck in my ways for too long." "We all have things we need to work on," Michael said gently. "But the important thing is to keep moving forward." Mrs. Whitman smiled faintly, a look of relief crossing her face. "Thank you. I'll let you get back to your cleaning." As she turned to leave, Michael called out, "Mrs. Whitman, before you go, would you like to take some leftovers? We have plenty, and I hate for good food to go to waste." She paused, clearly caught off guard, but then nodded. "That would be nice. Thank you." Michael went inside to pack up a plate of food for her. When he returned, Mrs. Whitman took the plate with a small smile. "Enjoy," he said warmly, "and don't be a stranger." As Mrs. Whitman walked back to her house, Michael felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it was progress, a small step toward healing the divide between them. That evening, as the sun set, Michael and Lisa sat on their porch, watching the kids play in the yard. "You think she'll come around?" Lisa asked. Michael smiled. "I think so. Sometimes all it takes is one gesture to start breaking down walls." And as the neighborhood quieted for the night, Michael felt hopeful. He had seen firsthand how kindness and patience could make a difference, and he was determined to keep building those connections, one step at a time. The week after the barbecue, something unexpected happened. As Michael and Lisa worked in the front yard, planting flowers and tidying up the garden, Mrs. Whitman approached them. She held a small plate of cookies in her hands, her expression nervous but determined. "Good morning," she said softly, standing at the edge of their driveway. Michael straightened up, brushing dirt off his hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman. What brings you by?" She hesitated, then stepped forward, holding out the plate. I baked these yesterday. I thought I'd bring some over, as a thank you for the leftovers you gave me. Lisa smiled warmly, stepping closer. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Mrs. Whitman handed the plate to Lisa, her hands trembling slightly. I've been thinking about what you said, Mr. Johnson, about community and change. I suppose I've been a little too quick to judge things I don't understand. Michael nodded, his tone gentle. It's not easy to embrace change, Mrs. Whitman, but I think it's worth it. It brings people together in ways we never expect. Mrs. Whitman looked down for a moment, then back up at Michael. I'd like to make an effort. I don't want to be a person who makes others feel unwelcome. Lisa glanced at Michael, a smile tugging at her lips. You're always welcome here, Mrs. Whitman. How about you join us for a cup of coffee? Mrs. Whitman looked surprised but nodded. That would be nice. The three of them sat on the porch, sharing coffee and cookies while the kids played in the yard. For the first time, Mrs. Whitman opened up about her life. She talked about how her husband had passed away years ago and how lonely she often felt. This neighborhood has always been my home, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. But lately, it feels like the world is moving too fast, and I'm being left behind. Michael listened carefully, his expression empathetic. I understand how that feels, he said. But the world changing doesn't mean you're being left behind. It means there's an opportunity to grow with it, to create new connections. Mrs. Whitman nodded slowly, her gaze softening. You're right, and I'd like to try. Lisa smiled warmly. That's all anyone can ask for. It's never too late to build something new. As the morning went on, Mrs. Whitman began to relax. She even laughed when Emily ran up to her, proudly showing off a flower she had picked. It's for you, Emily said, her face beaming. Mrs. Whitman took the flower with a small smile. Thank you, dear. It's lovely. When she finally left, Michael and Lisa watched her walk back to her house, a noticeable lightness in her step. That was unexpected, Lisa said, glancing at Michael. He nodded, a satisfied smile on his face. It's amazing what a little kindness can do. Over the next few days, Mrs. Whitman began to interact more with the neighbors. She greeted people as they passed by, and even stopped to chat with some of the other families. Slowly but surely, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. For Michael, it wasn't just about one barbecue or one neighbor. It was about showing how small acts of understanding could spark real change. And as he watched Mrs. Whitman make an effort, he felt a renewed sense of hope for their community. The journey wasn't over, but it was clear they were on the right path. One step at a time, they were building something stronger and more meaningful, a neighborhood where everyone could truly belong. The transformation in the neighborhood was slow but steady. Over the weeks following the barbecue, Mrs. Whitman began to change. She was no longer the aloof neighbor who peeked out from behind her curtains. Instead, she became a familiar presence on her front porch, waving at neighbors as they passed by. It was a small but meaningful shift, and it didn't go unnoticed. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Whitman surprised everyone again. She walked across the street to the Johnsons' house, holding a basket filled with fresh muffins. Michael, who was watering the garden, looked up with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman." "Good morning, Michael," she said, her tone softer than he'd ever heard. "I thought I'd bring these over. I'm trying my hand at baking more these days." Lisa stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "That's so thoughtful of you." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitman. Would you like to join us for some tea?" Mrs. Whitman hesitated, but then she nodded. "I'd like that." As they sat on the porch, sipping tea and sharing the muffins, Mrs. Whitman shared stories from her past. She talked about her late husband, how they'd moved into the neighborhood decades ago, and how different things were back then. "I think I held on to the past too tightly," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But your family has shown me that change isn't always bad. Sometimes, it's exactly what we need." Michael smiled. It takes courage to see that, Mrs. Whitman, and we're glad to have you as part of our community." That afternoon, something remarkable happened. The Johnsons decided to host another barbecue, this time inviting even more neighbors. They wanted to create a space where everyone could come together and get to know one another. Lisa and Michael worked tirelessly to prepare the food, while their kids helped set up the tables and decorations in the backyard. To everyone's surprise, Mrs. Whitman arrived early, carrying a tray of her freshly baked cookies. "Where should I put these?" she asked, her smile shy but genuine. Lisa guided her to the table, her face lighting up with gratitude. "Right here, Mrs. Whitman. Thank you so much for contributing." As the barbecue got underway, the backyard buzzed with energy and laughter. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now chatting like old friends. Kids played together on the lawn, their laughter filling the air. And in the midst of it all, Mrs. Whitman sat at a table, smiling as she joined in on the conversations. When it was time for Michael to give his customary toast, he raised his glass high. "Tonight is about community," he said, his voice strong and clear. "It's about understanding, kindness, and the willingness to grow together. To everyone here, thank you for making this neighborhood what it is. Here's to building something stronger, one connection at a time." The crowd erupted in cheers, raising their glasses in unison. Mrs. Whitman, sitting among her neighbors, lifted her glass too, her eyes glistening with emotion. As the night wore on, and the stars began to twinkle, Michael sat back and watched the scene before him. His backyard was filled with joy, laughter, and the kind of unity he had always dreamed of. It wasn't just a barbecue, it was a symbol of what they could achieve together. Looking over at Mrs. Whitman, now surrounded by friendly faces, Michael felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Change wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Together, they had turned a moment of tension into a lasting bond, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark something extraordinary. And as the night ended, the Johnsons knew this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new chapter for their neighborhood, one where everyone belonged.